Whilst we see a lot of Source Direct tracks take that more atmospheric rolling jungle approach, we do every now and again see them veer into more Drumfunk territory with some incredibly detailed drum break programming. So we're in Renoise again with a completely different track now, and I'm just going to roll you through a whole bunch of different techniques here for getting that Drumfunk style into your own tunes. So the first thing is velocities. Now velocities seem very simple on the surface, but a few kind of rules of thumb I follow is that I never have two drums of the same type next to each other without changing the velocities a little bit in one of them. And I think that little bit of humanization really helps, and there's lots of little things you're going to hear here that make a bigger whole. So I take off this velocity, it really just humanizes that drum at the start. Sounds a bit rubbish actually, the roll. 3 of the same type without any velocity changes, it sounds a bit robotic. But with that little velocity in it, it sounds a lot better. The second thing is to actually use alternate versions of the drum hits in your break. So your kicks, snares and shuffles, quite often in the original break you'll have different variations of these hits, and so you can swap your hits for those different variations to give you that more human feel. And if I just show you a little example here, I've got, that's like a little ghost snare and a hat maybe. That's a snare and a roll. That's just a flat out snare with a slightly different tone. That's another snare with a roll. And so anyway, I've got all these different types of variation in this break. So the next one is about layering percussion, and sometimes your drum break might be really interesting itself, but just adding a few percussion layers quite often on the actual hit. So dead on a snare or dead on a kick can really add to kind of the punch of those hits, or just create interesting variations rather than having to actually vary the individual element of the break. Another interesting thing to think about here is the way you're actually layering up these perk hits with the drum break hits. And what I mean by this is I've got these 2 stomps here, and then I've got the metallic hit. And so what I've done is layered the stomps with the kicks and the metallic hit on the snare. And you can syncopate these hits and actually not layer them entirely on the beats. But I think it's interesting to layer in this way, because you're reinforcing that metallic hit on the snare, is reinforcing what was already there before. So anyone who's been watching my channel for a little while now will know that I mess with reverb snares a lot, and what I will go and do is create all of these slight variations of my original snare drum from the break, but with lots of long reverb tails and slightly different tones to them. And so I can then use them in a slightly different way, and I'm just doing 2 clever things here I want to show you. The first one is, the way Renoise works is that if I program this snare on the top of this lane, when this next note hits, it's actually going to gate that snare, because this lane is a monophonic lane, so the next note that plays is going to cut off the last one. But if I actually put it in a different note lane, it's going to play on longer, and so if I just have nothing there, you can hear it ringing out. So you can mess with having the snares ringing out over the top of your other hits, or having them chop off. And then another cool thing I'm doing here is I had this issue where I had this this hit here, and can you hear it's got a bit of dead space in it? and it sounds rubbish. It just cuts to silence and that just sounds really crap. So what I did is actually I still wanted to use that hit, but I've gone to one of my snares again, and I'm actually just nicking this tail bit. So I'm nicking the tail of the reverb of the snare, and then I'm triggering it with the slice command. So it's not going to trigger from the transient, it's going to trigger just in the tail bit. And so I'm programming like this hit with this little tail element, just to make it ring out a little bit longer, and so you can combine those snare tails with other hits actually, just to use a bit of that long reverb tail to camouflage some of that dead silence you get when the hits aren't long enough. Another really classic trick is to actually pitch around the snare, and so this is really simple. In Renoise, I will go and find wherever my snare is, find the snare instrument, copy it, and then just come to a new track and paste the snare into a new track, and then you can pitch this one all up and down the keyboard again. So this is especially useful if you have a break which doesn't have lots of variations in the drum hits. It only had a little kind of open section to take the break. You can pitch the snare around to give you some of those variations that weren't there in the original break. As well as pitching around the snares, another really common thing to do is to pitch around ethnic percussion and just interesting percussion elements. And if I come to this instrument, it's hard to really hear where the natural pitch of this, but I feel like it was a low drum, like a low boomy drum to start with, but actually it's got quite an interesting tone pitching it up. And when I do the same thing again where I layer it on my original drum break elements, as well as sending it off to a send effect here, so I'm doing the same thing I showed you in the last tutorial where I did, I've got these two effects off here, and then when it hits this line they both shoot up. So I'm just having the effect off, turning it on for this one hit. So I'm actually doing it on the line before the hit, so it's sending here, and then I'm turning it off again for the next hit. Another really useful trick is to use the cut command or the Cxx command. Now this is quite often used for gating, but the way I also use it is to control the tail end of a hit. And I can explain this here. So what I've got is a little snare roll happening at the end of this passage. But if I don't have this COB command in, can you hear that two notes? They're sort of flamming, like the end of this note starts to overlap with the start of this one. And it sounds really rubbish. So what I do is I put this C0B command in, and it cleans that up, and what it's doing is just cutting the real tail end of this note off, like the last tick or two is what it's cutting off. So that's one really useful trick with the Cxx command. And then another really useful trick that you can do is, or a more common trick actually, is to use it for gating. Now here I'm cutting to 0 again, so the first number is 0 and the second one is going to be the tick amount. So I'm cutting to 0, 5 ticks in. Well, it's not going to be 5 ticks, but it's 5 is the setting. And you can create really mad gating effects that way. So I'm combining gating effects there with also pitching up one of those snare drums to create a really crazy effect, but it sounds cool. Now another thing I want to talk about is reverse effects, and there's actually two main ways I'm using this just in this break programming stuff here. And so one is a more obvious reverse effect where you're just taking a note here. So I've taken a snare drum by the looks of it, And I will almost always combine the Bxx command with the Sxx command, and so I can detail where I'm actually reversing this point from. So if I change this Sxx command, I can reverse it from different points. And so I can really control that whip back into the next hit. So that sounds very cool as it is. And then I've done a much more subtle one here, and this is the way the Bxx command works, where if you put it on a note layer, it's going to reverse from the end of the note, or the end of that hit. But if you actually put it after the instrument has happened, if I can find this note, what I'm going to have is this, the note plays forwards, and then it hits the Bxx command, and then it reverses. So you get a much more subtle effect there. But it's still got a nice little shh back into the next instrument. And then the final way I'm doing this is actually at the end of this passage, and it's just a really good way to loop back into the next one. You have this really subtle pull back into the downbeat of the next bar. So this is good at the end of a 4 bar or an 8 bar. Just a tiny little reverse effect. And you can keep them more subtle, but it just has that which gets you kind of your ear flowing back into the next passage. So it's a good way to help the turnaround sections and to whip you back into a new section as well. Another really cool effect, which I don't actually utilize that much in Renoise, is this retrigger effect. But what you've got to do with this, I think, to make it sound good, is actually combine it with a volume effect per line. So if I just show you here, it really makes a big difference. If I take this away, it sounds really robotic and just too breakcore-y. But if I add this little bit of volume automation, sounds way better. So combining automation, volume automation with the Rxx command is something that you can do to really improve it and make it a lot more usable. But if you don't want to do that, you can actually just do it per note, and you have more control doing it per note, but it is obviously a lot more effort. And one thing I'm doing here, because I'm working at 4 lines per beat, every one of these lines is representing a 16th note. But if I want to create 32nd notes, what I can do is copy a note to a new note column, and then I can actually delay it by 80. So 80 is going to give me a 32nd note. And then what I'm also doing is playing lots with the velocities, and I'm also slightly throwing off the delay time as well. So I've got some swing happening with my roll here. But really, it's all about the velocities are making probably the biggest difference here when you want to get these rolls to sound good. If you take the velocities away, it sounds horrible and robotic, but with the velocities, it sounds much better. And then finally, what I've done here is a kind of combination of all of these tricks, and I'm doing this 2-lane stuff, but I'm also re-triggering just one of the lanes. Now, the way these effects work in Renoise is if the effects are put in the actual notes kind of effect column, they're only going to affect this note. But if I put this one, let me just get this in here, then it would affect this whole line. So you can mess with things like that as well. So I've got this effect happening. If I put it back there. So that's a really cool effect I've managed to achieve by combining kind of all of these things together. So like cool without it, but with it, it's got that like a little bump of energy in it. Sounds really satisfying. Regarding drum rolls, I think there's 2 very viable techniques to achieving good sounding drum rolls. And the first one is obviously to use velocities and note data and just program it here in the note column. So you can get good snare rolls that way. But another one is to actually take a individual snare and then to put a loop point in it, a forwards loop. and then you can create snare rolls this way. Now what I can see here, if I right click and set this to beats, you can see you've got this information, and just looking at it here, this 1-1 and this 1.2, this is going to be a 16th note, this 1-1, and this is going to be an 8th note, and so on. So you can actually create really accurate rolls this way as well, which are going to perfectly line up with your lines and your BPM. But one other thing I'm doing on this layer is I'm using a volume envelope to really control it, but also a little volume LFO, just subtly changing, so every hit's going to be at a slightly different level, and it's going to give you slightly more realistic drum rolls if you're going to use this looping technique as well. Okay, so now I've got a few things I want to throw about you with regards to the turnaround. So this is at the end of the 4 bars or the 8 bars, when you just want to create a little bit more interest in these little kind of fill sections where it's a good point to add some variation. And the first one is so obvious and so simple, but some breaks that you have or that you use will have already in them some really nice fill elements. So if I go to this break here, has this lovely little roll already in the break, and so just utilizing things that are already there, it's so easy. But I think sometimes you're just programming with lots of kicks and snares and forgetting that a lot of these breaks have toms in them or rolls and things like that, or even crashes and rides, and so adding all of the elements from the original break in or utilizing them all is a really good thing to do. Another thing I went over a little bit before is actually to use a reverse element right at the end. At this is the last 16th bar, so the last 16th note or 8th note of a passage, to have that little back in. So it's so subtle that you barely even hear it, but it does help to just groove you and whip you back into the next section. Now another thing to do at the end here is to, if you're not going to use a reverse hit, is to actually use a kick. So this is a snare at the moment, but if I change this to a kick, not that kick maybe, that one's perfect. And then another thing I love to do is to use these long kick and snare samples, because you want to have a bit of space before you're going to go into a drop or something like that. But you don't ever want it to be silent. So using a snare with a long reverb is such a good way to fill the space at the end of a passage. Another great Drumfunk trick is actually to mess with the decay and also the pitch of the hits as a whole. Now this is only going to work if you chop your break up into all its individual elements. If you've got the break as longer chunks, this isn't going to work so well. But because I've chopped this break up into all the kicks and the hats and snares, etc., I can actually automate the pitch. And the decay to create pitched versions and different more snappy versions of the break, and just use that live programming it here. So I've done this instrument macros thing, which is going to connect the pitch and decay from this instrument to this main window, and then I can just modulate these things as I'm going. So in a similar fashion, I'm using one of my favorite plugins, which is Filter Freak, and I'm modulating the frequency with all this step automation. But what I love to do is mess with the inputs and the outputs and the frequency, and also sometimes the resonance, to create all these interesting effects where you're not going to lose loudness. You can keep the break sounding really loud, even though you're going to pull away a lot of the high frequencies. You can turn up the input gain. You're always going to get a bit of that filter sweeping sound, but it actually sounds fine in the context of a track. Another trick we hear Source Direct employ a lot is break swapping, and sometimes you can get really crazy with this, but what I quite like to do is do little chunks. So maybe the first, this is the first bar of this section is going to be one break, and then I'm going to swap for that second bar. And so to keep things fairly structural, even though you're swapping the breaks, can sometimes sound a little bit more cohesive. Okay, so that's really it for me today, and I've really done my best to show you both the more atmospheric style of drum break programming and also the more Drumfunk style, and I've thrown loads of tips and tricks at you there that hopefully you can bring into your own workflows. So you'll catch me very soon in the next one, and we've got something on pads and maybe some of the instruments and stuff and the bass I've used in this track. And then that's really going to wrap up this Source Direct series, and we can move on to the next one. So thank you very much for all the support and for sticking with me up till now, and I will catch you very soon back on this channel. Peace.